She had looked at herself in the mirror of the coaching inn that morning and decided she looked exactly right. Not too refined, not too rough. The gray dress was plain enough, the kind a woman of middling means might wear when applying for a position in service. She had borrowed it from the innkeeper's daughter, a girl about her size, in exchange for a pair of earrings that had once belonged to her mother. The girl had seemed delighted by the trade. Isolde Pemworth had felt nothing at all about it, which told her more about the state of her heart than she cared to examine. She tied her hair back without looking in the mirror again. The carriage let her off at the end of the lane, just as she had asked, and she walked the remaining half-mile to Ashverton on foot. She knew the road. She had walked it hundreds of times as a child, first on short legs that had to work twice as hard to keep up with her father's long stride, and later on her own, when the grounds had been hers to wander as she pleased. She knew where the lane curved and where the old oak had split itself in two during the storm of her 14th year, and where the stone wall had been patched badly after a cart took out the corner. She knew this road the way she knew her own name, which was, at the moment, something she was not using. The gates of Ashverton came into view, and she did not slow her pace. That was the important thing, not to slow down, not to hesitate, not to let whatever was building in her chest reach her face. She had a letter of introduction in her bag, obtained through channels she had rather not think about too carefully. And she had a story that was mostly true. She was a woman of good but reduced circumstances, seeking a position as a lady's companion. She was well-spoken. She was discreet. She came highly recommended by a household in Derbyshire that had, conveniently, recently disbanded. She was also the rightful owner of every stone in this house, every acre of the grounds, every portrait on every wall. But that, for now, was beside the point. The housekeeper who answered the servant's entrance was a compact woman in her 50s with iron-colored hair and the expression of someone who had been managing large households for so long that she had ceased to find people interesting. She introduced herself as Mrs. Crane. She looked Isolde over in the thorough and slightly impersonal way that experienced housekeepers look over new applicants, taking in the dress, the posture, the hands, the eyes, and seemed to reach a conclusion. "You have your letter," she said. Isolde produced it. Mrs. Crane read it in silence, then folded it and handed it back. "His Grace is in residence through the end of the month. Her Grace, the Dowager, that is, requires a companion for the evenings, someone to read to her and manage her correspondence. She does not like idle chatter, and she does not like sentiment. Can you manage that?" "I can," Isolde said. "You'll be paid quarterly. Your half-day is Thursday. You'll take your meals in the servants' hall unless Her Grace specifically requests otherwise." She paused. "Do you have any objection to dogs?" "Her Grace keeps spaniels." "No objection. Then come in." That was how Isolde Pemworth walked back into the house her grandfather had built. She did not look at anything directly for the first 2 days. It was a discipline she had imposed on herself on the long journey from Edinburgh, where she had spent the past 8 months living in a set of rented rooms, and trying to understand how a person could lose everything she had ever known in the space of a single afternoon. She had understood, eventually, that grief tended to make one careless, and careless was not something she could afford to be. So she looked at the servants' hall and the back stairs and the housekeeper's sitting room, and she did not look at the portraits in the east corridor or the drawing room, with its yellow curtains, or the window at the end of the main hall that let in the western light on autumn afternoons in a way that she had never seen replicated anywhere else in the world. She was a companion. She was here to read aloud and manage correspondence. She was not here to want things. The Dowager Duchess of Hartwell, whose name was Adelaide, and who was 71 years old and had buried 2 husbands, 1 son, and what she frequently referred to as her tolerance for fools, received Isolde on the third morning. She was seated in the blue sitting room, Isolde's grandmother's sitting room, though she did not say so, and she looked at Isolde for a long moment before she spoke. "Mrs. Crane tells me you're from the north," she said. "Yorkshire, Your Grace." "You don't sound like Yorkshire. I was educated in Bath." The dowager made a sound that was not quite approval, but was adjacent to it. "Can you read clearly?" my last companion mumbled. I told her 3 times, and she continued to mumble. I could not abide it. "I've been told I read clearly, Your Grace. We'll see." She gestured to a small table where a novel lay open face down. "Begin there, 3rd paragraph." Isolde began. She read for 20 minutes without interruption, and at the end of it, the dowager closed her eyes, which Isolde understood to mean she had passed. She had been in the house for 4 days when she first saw the Duke. He came in from the stables just as she was crossing the main hall with a parcel of the dowager's correspondence, still in his riding coat, pulling off his gloves. He was younger than she had expected, 30, perhaps, or just past it, with dark hair that the wind had done considerable damage to, and the look of a man who had spent the morning doing something strenuous, and was quietly satisfied about it. He stopped when he saw her, not in a way that suggested she had startled him, but in the way that people stop when they have not expected to encounter someone and are briefly recalibrating. "You must be the new companion," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Isolde," she caught herself, half a beat too late. "Webb, I arrived on Monday. My grandmother approves of you, which is not nothing." He said it without particular warmth, but without condescension either, which was more than she had anticipated. "She made the last one cry in under a week. I'll endeavor to last longer." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "Good luck, Miss Webb," he said, and continued down the corridor. Isolde stood where she was for a moment. That was the Duke of Hartwell, Cassius Rentham, the man who, 8 months ago, had become the legal owner of Ashverton after a process that she still did not entirely understand, and that her solicitor, the third one she had consulted, had told her she had perhaps a 20% chance of successfully contesting. She had decided 20% was enough. The Duke of Hartwell had come into possession of Ashverton through Isolde's uncle, a man named Isolde Pemworth, who had served as the estate's trustee during the 7 months following Isolde's father's death. The will, which Isolde had been present for the reading of, had stated unambiguously that Ashverton and its lands were to pass to her, with Gerald serving in an administrative capacity only until she came fully into her inheritance at 25. Isolde had turned 25 in November. What she had received for her birthday was a letter from Gerald's solicitor explaining that there had been irregularities, a word she had come to hate with considerable feeling, and that the matter was, regrettably, before the courts. What she had not received was any further explanation of how, while the matter was before the courts, Gerald had sold the house to the Duke of Hartwell. She had not yet figured out the connection between her uncle and the Duke. She intended to. The dowager, for her part, was an unexpectedly useful source of information. She did not like idle chatter, as Mrs. Crane had warned, but she liked purposeful conversation, liked being asked about things, liked having opinions and expressing them at length. Isolde was a careful and patient listener, and she was very good at directing conversations without appearing to direct them. "Your grandson seems to find Ashverton agreeable," she ventured one afternoon during a pause in the letter reading. "He finds it quiet," the dowager said. "He's had a great deal of trouble in London. The estate business has been a headache. He said so himself, which Cassius does not say lightly. He has a high threshold for headaches, rather like his father." She pursed her lips. He did not want the place, frankly. It came to him through some arrangement with Isolde Pemworth, whom I found to be an unpleasant man on the 2 occasions I had the misfortune of meeting him. Cassius honored the arrangement because he felt he was obligated to. He has a very developed sense of obligation. He did not want it, Isolde repeated carefully. He has 3 other properties. He does not need a 4th. The dowager picked up a spaniel that had been attempting to climb her skirts. He intends to resolve the legal situation and sell it on. He told me so at dinner last week. Isolde was very quiet for a moment. He intended to sell it. She did not know why this should affect her. She had known, intellectually, that she was not the only person who might want to possess Ashverton, but something about hearing it stated plainly in that calm and indifferent way made the thing in her chest pull tight in a way she had not felt since she'd stood outside the gates of the house on the day she'd been made to leave. She returned to the letters. Her voice did not change. There was, it turned out, another woman. Isolde encountered her on the 6th day, a Thursday, when she came downstairs to find a carriage in the drive that had not been there at breakfast. The woman who had arrived in it was perhaps 28, with golden hair and the particular kind of beauty that announces itself when it enters a room and expects the room to take notice. Her name was Octavia Linden. She was the daughter of Viscount Staveley. She had arrived with her mother and a quantity of luggage that suggested she did not intend to be here briefly. She was, the housemaid informed Isolde in a carefully neutral tone, a guest of the Duke. Isolde was careful after that to take note of what she saw. She saw Octavia Linden speak to the kitchen maid, who brought her afternoon tea with the tone of a woman who has never had to consider whether the people who served her had inner lives. She saw her leave a dinner gown in a heap on the floor with the apparent confidence that someone would pick it up. She saw her address the dowager with a kind of surface warmth that vanished entirely the moment the dowager's attention was elsewhere. She saw the Duke watch Octavia across the dinner table on the 2nd night of her visit with the expression of a man who was being carefully evaluated and knew it, and was not entirely sure how he felt about it. She did not see, or did not allow herself to see, whether he admired her. On the morning of the 7th day, the Duke came into the library before breakfast. Isolde was there already, having developed the habit of using the early morning hours to work through the dowager's correspondence before the day's other demands began. She did not hear him come in. The library was one of the rooms she had allowed herself to look at, and she had perhaps been looking too hard at the shelf where her father's copy of a particular history of the Roman Empire still stood, 1st edition, with his initials penciled inside the front cover, and when she heard footsteps she turned rather abruptly and knocked an inkwell off the edge of the desk. The Duke caught it. He had quick reflexes. She filed this away, along with everything else she had filed away about him. That he was careful with the staff, that he thanked people, that he read the estate reports himself rather than delegating them, that he spent more time in the stables and the tenant cottages than he did in the formal rooms of the house. "I did not mean to startle you," he said, setting the inkwell down. "You didn't," she said, which was not entirely true. He looked at the shelf she had been looking at. Then he looked at her. Something in his expression had changed, very slightly, in the way that happens when a person is turning a thought over. "Do you know this house?" he asked. The question was conversational, idle, but her heart did a thing she would rather it had not done. "Only in the way one comes to know any house one works in," she said. "I've been learning the rooms." He nodded, but he did not look entirely satisfied with the answer. He pulled the history of Rome from the shelf, opened it, and looked at the penciled initials inside. A.P. She had forgotten about those. Her father's name had been Arthur. He closed the book and put it back. "There are initials in most of the books in here," he said. A.P. I wondered. "Old libraries accumulate a history," she said. "It's part of their character." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Yes," and took himself to the other end of the room to find whatever he had come for. Isolde returned to the letters. Her hands were completely steady. She was rather proud of this. The evening of the 9th day was when things began to come apart. Octavia Linden had organized a small dinner party. She had, somehow, within the space of 3 days, positioned herself as a kind of informal hostess, a positioning that Isolde noticed and that the dowager appeared to find mildly irritating, and had invited several families from the neighboring estates. Isolde was not present at the dinner, being neither a guest nor at that point required by the dowager, who had retired early with a headache. She was in the servants' hall when Mrs. Crane sent for her, and when she arrived at the sitting room, it was to find that one of the dinner guests, a woman of about 60, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to, had discovered a water stain on a painting near the chimney breast, and had become rather agitated about it. The painting was a portrait of Isolde's grandmother. Isolde looked at the stain. She had known it was there. She had known it since she was 9 years old and had been forbidden from playing anywhere near the fireplace with a glass of anything, a rule that had come directly from her father, who had been appalled by the damage and had intended to have the portrait restored. He had not gotten around to it. She said, "I'll note it for the estate manager, ma'am," in a tone that was calm and clear, and did not in any way suggest that she was looking at her own grandmother's face. The woman thanked her and moved on. Isolde did not move on immediately. She stood and looked at the portrait for a moment, at the dark eyes that were, several people had told her, the same dark eyes she had, and at the expression on her grandmother's face, which had been captured in the particular way that very good painters sometimes managed, a kind of settled certainty, the look of a woman standing in a place that belonged to her. Miss Webb. She turned. The Duke was standing in the doorway. She had not heard him come in. Again, he was disturbingly quiet for a large man. "Your Grace," she said. He looked at the portrait, then at her, then at the portrait again, and she watched something happen in his face, something that was not quite recognition, because he did not know who she was, but that was adjacent to it, a kind of puzzle presenting itself. "My grandmother tells me you have been with us 10 days, he said. "Yes, Your Grace. She also tells me you know a great deal about this house." A pause. More than she would expect from 10 days. She said nothing. He took a slow step into the room, not toward her exactly, but not away from her either. He looked at the portrait again. "The family who owned this estate before it came to me," he said carefully. "I have been attempting to understand the situation more fully. Gerald Pemworth was the trustee, his niece was the heir." He stopped. "I have not been able to locate her." Isolde held herself very still. "I was told she had removed herself to the continent," he continued. "That she had accepted the situation." "Did you believe that?" she said. She had not intended to say it. It came out of some place in her that had been very quiet for a long time. The Duke looked at her. "No," he said after a moment. "I did not." The silence in the room was very specific. Outside, she could hear the dinner party continuing. Voices, the soft sound of a pianoforte beginning in the next room, Octavia Linden's particular bright laugh. "I purchased this house in good faith," the Duke said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. "I was assured the sale was clean. I have since developed certain doubts about that assurance." She looked at him. She had spent 8 months being angry about this, in the way that people are angry about things they cannot change, hot and exhausting, and ultimately not very useful. But standing here now, in this room, looking at this man, who was looking at her the way he was looking at her, she felt something different, not forgiveness, exactly, something more structural than that. "The letters," she said, "the ones my uncle's solicitor sent to my address in Edinburgh. I have them. All of them. They are," she paused, "instructive." "Edinburgh," he said, very quietly. "I have been consulting with a solicitor myself. I have been doing so for several months. There is a case." She met his eyes. There has always been a case. Something passed across his face. It was complicated, whatever it was, and she was not practiced enough in reading him to know all of what it contained. She thought she saw something that might have been relief. She thought she might have been mistaken about that. "Miss Webb," he said slowly. "Is that your name?" She let a breath go. "My name is Isolde Pemworth. I am Arthur Pemworth's daughter. This house belonged to my father and his father before him, and my uncle had no legal authority to sell it, and I have come to prove that." She had not planned to say all of it at once. She had planned something considerably more gradual. But she found she was done being gradual. The Duke was quiet for a long moment. She could not read him at all, and she had stopped trying. She stood in her borrowed gray dress in her grandmother's sitting room and waited for whatever came next. "I see," he said, at last. That was all he said. She woke the next morning to find a message from Mrs. Crane asking her to come to the study after breakfast. She dressed quickly and went down, expecting. She was not sure what she expected. Something formal, something cold. She had spent a portion of the night preparing herself for it. What she found was the Duke seated at her father's desk, with 3 stacks of documents in front of him, and beside him a man she did not know who was introduced as Mr. Threlfall, his solicitor, who had apparently been summoned from the village where he had been staying on other business. "Sit down, please," the Duke said. She sat. "I have been reviewing the correspondence you mentioned," he said, "along with certain documents pertaining to the original sale. I asked Threlfall to come because I wanted his opinion." Threlfall was a thin man with the air of someone who had seen a considerable number of legal disputes and had developed a philosophical attitude toward them. "The Pemworth trustee arrangement," he said carefully, "has several peculiarities that I confess I should have examined more closely when the sale was first proposed. His Grace has acknowledged that he shares this view." "I want to understand what happened," the Duke said. "Not for my benefit." He looked at her directly. "For yours." She sat with that for a moment. "My uncle borrowed against the estate," she said. "I believe he had been doing so for some time, using his position as trustee to access funds he was not entitled to. When I came of age and the estate was due to pass to me, he would have been liable. The sale," she stopped, then continued, "was a way to make the liability disappear." "Yes," Threlfall said. "That is consistent with what we're seeing." "It's fraud," the Duke said flatly. "It's fraud," Threlfall agreed. They looked at her. She looked at the documents on the desk where her father had sat to do his correspondence, where she had sat as a child and done her lessons when the schoolroom was being repainted, where she had last sat to sign the papers agreeing to vacate the property while the matter was, as Gerald's solicitor had said, regrettably before the courts. "What happens now?" she said, and it was not quite a question. "That depends on you," the Duke said, "but I will tell you what I intend." He looked at the documents, then back at her. "I intend to transfer the property. The legal process will take time. Threlfall will explain the steps, but I have no interest in holding what is not mine to hold." She had not expected that. She had expected a fight. She had expected more lawyers and more letters and more waiting in rented rooms in northern cities watching her savings diminish. She had not expected him to simply say it. "You would do that," she said, "without a contest. It is your house," he said. "That was true before I knew your name, and it is still true now." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze steadily, without flinching from whatever he saw in her face, and she suspected she looked rather more undone than she would have preferred. "There is the matter of Octavia Linden," she said, because she was a person who said difficult things rather than leaving them to gather in a corner. Something crossed his face. "Yes, she is here under a particular expectation. She is here under an expectation I have not confirmed," he said, and though he said it quietly, there was something definite in it. "That situation will be addressed. It is separate from this one." Isolde nodded. She did not say anything else about it. The following weeks were strange. The legal machinery that Threlfall set in motion was not fast. Nothing in the law ever is. But it moved, which was more than it had done in 8 months. Gerald Pemworth, confronted by his nephew-in-law's solicitor and the prospect of a fraud examination, developed a sudden and keen interest in cooperation. The documents that had been mysteriously unavailable became available. The irregularities resolved themselves into a clear picture, which was ugly and straightforward, and in the end, not particularly complicated. Octavia Linden departed on a Wednesday, with her mother and the quantity of luggage, in a carriage that pulled away while Isolde was reading to the dowager in the blue sitting room. She heard the wheels on the gravel. She did not go to the window. She continued reading. The dowager, who was a person of formidable perception and had been one for 71 years, said, when she finished the paragraph, "You may stop there." Isolde stopped. "My grandson," the dowager said, "is a man of principle. He has been one since he was a boy, which has occasionally made him inconvenient to be around, but I have always found it preferable to the alternative." She looked at Isolde over the top of her spaniels. "You are also a person of principle. I recognized it early. I had thought it was what made you a good companion. Your Grace." "I know who you are," the dowager said. "I have known since the 2nd week. There is a portrait of your grandmother in the sitting room, and you have her eyes and her jaw and her way of standing when she is working to contain something." She set down the dog. "I said nothing because I thought you might have your reasons for the arrangement, and you clearly did." Isolde looked at her. "You might have told me," she said finally. "I might have," the dowager agreed. "But it would have made things more complicated for Cassius, and I was curious to see how it would resolve itself." She paused. "I was also curious about you. I am satisfied on both counts." The transfer of the deed was completed on a cold morning in early December. Threlfall brought the documents to the library, a location that Isolde found either poetic or absurd. She could not decide which, and the Duke signed his name on the papers that returned Ashverton to her. She watched his pen move across the page. She had expected to feel something large and immediate when it happened. What she actually felt was quieter than that. A kind of settling, the way a house settles after a long period of strain, finding its original weight and resting there. When he had finished, he set the pen down and looked at her. "It's yours," he said. She took the document and held it. It was warm from being on the desk by the fire. "Thank you," she said. "That seems insufficient. For what you've done, I have not done anything that was not owed. You could have contested it," she said. "Most people in your position would have." "I am not most people," he said mildly. She laughed, which surprised her. He looked surprised as well, and then he was almost smiling. And the library was warm and full of morning light, and it occurred to her, standing there holding the papers that gave her back her life, that this man, this entirely unexpected, rather inconvenient man, had become, somewhere in the past week, someone she trusted. That was not a small thing. She had not trusted many people lately. She had not had reason to. He stayed through the month. She was not entirely sure why, and she did not ask, because she was learning to stop asking questions that she was afraid to hear the answers to. He stayed, and he was in the library most mornings, and they talked about the estate, at first, about the repairs that were needed, and the tenants she would need to meet, and the accounts that she would need to review. And then about other things. He had opinions about history and strong opinions about architecture, which she found endearing in a way she had not anticipated. She told him about Edinburgh, about the rented rooms and the solicitors, and the strange suspended quality of those months, of feeling as though she were waiting for her life to begin again and not being sure if it was going to. He listened to all of it, without interrupting. On a Thursday evening in late December, he found her in the gardens. It had snowed, That afternoon, not heavily, but enough to put a thin layer of white over everything. The hedges, the gravel paths, the stone bench where she was sitting in her coat with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. She had come out because the house had felt too full of itself, too present, and she had needed a moment to simply be somewhere quiet. He came and sat beside her without asking whether she wanted company. She found she did not mind. They sat in silence for a while. The grounds were very still. "Do you know what I thought?" he said eventually. "When I first came here?" She shook her head. "I thought it was the kind of house that had been well loved." He was looking out at the white-covered garden. "You can tell with houses. Something in the way things are, placed, cared for. I have seen a great many houses that had money spent on them. This was different." She looked at the garden, too. "My father loved it," she said. "He used to say that a house knows when it's been taken care of, that it remembers." "I believe that," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the house, at the lit windows, at the stone that her grandfather had quarried and cut and laid with such careful intention. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it simply, without preamble. As she had come to understand, he said most things. "Not for the purchase. I have told you I did that in good faith. But for the months between. For not looking more carefully. For accepting a version of events that, had I examined it, honestly, I would have seen was incomplete." "You didn't know me," she said. "I didn't. But I knew something was not right, and I did not press on it the way I should have." He looked at her. "I am sorry for that." She held the apology for a moment the way she had held the deed that morning, feeling its weight, its temperature. "I accept it," she said. He nodded. The cold had gotten into her fingertips. She stood, and he stood with her, and they walked back toward the house through the thin snow that crackled very quietly under their feet. At the door she stopped. "You could stay," she said, "through the new year, if you wanted." She kept her voice neutral with some effort. "Your grandmother has made it very clear she does not wish to be moved in this weather, and someone should be here to see the accounts through the first quarter, and," she paused, "I find I do not mind your company." He looked at her. She looked back, which she was finding less difficult than she once had. "That is," he said slowly, "the most qualified invitation I have ever received. I am practicing restraint." "Please don't," he said, and he was almost smiling again, and she thought perhaps she would allow herself to almost smile back. She had her house. She had her grandmother's portrait, and her father's initials in the first edition books, and the window at the end of the hall that caught the last of the western light. She had a great deal of work ahead of her, and a legal process that was not quite finished, and an uncle who would need to answer for things, and all the unglamorous machinery of reclaiming a life. She had all of that, and she had, standing beside her on the threshold of the house that had always been hers, a man who had given it back without being asked, who had listened to her in a library full of her father's books, who had sat beside her in a cold garden and meant every word he said. The snow had stopped. Through the windows, Ashverton glowed. She opened the door and went inside.